Good evening and welcome. And I'll start off by saying that my book has a lot of quotes in it. And I've decided I'm not going to read any quotes to you. You'll be relieved to know. So you can look at the book. I'm just going to talk to you directly. I'm not going to say that many dates or even names of the individuals involved. So I think that Zoom is already a remote experience and I don't want to clutter it up. So we'll have a conversation about things, and I hope you can send in any questions you have uh, to Sarah, and then we can, I'll take them, be happy to take them at the end. So let's start with this first image, which is what a lot of people think is, they'll think of when they think of Shakers, they'll think of the furniture. And that's how I got started, actually interested in the furniture and learning more about the Shakers. Who wouldn't like to learn more about a piece of art of this type? And I did. As I read more and more about what the Shakers were doing and saying, I got interested in what they had to say for themselves. So as I say in the introduction to my book, I had thought about, a good subtitle for the book would be The Shakers in Their Own Words. I've tried to go through and look as many Shaker documents and find out what the Shakers themselves actually said. And I'm sure they, so there are a couple of reasons why I don't talk much about furniture. There's only a few paragraphs in my book about furniture. One is because I was looking at what they said and they didn't say that much about their furniture. And there's also been so much great work done on the furniture. I would say the study of Shaker furniture has been done so well. It's probably the best studied and the best understood aspect of maybe all of American material culture. That's been a very studied area. And the same also for the spiritual art, some of the gift drawings and so forth. That's also been very well studied, as of course have been the Shaker villages and architecture itself. So I'm looking very broadly at what the Shakers were actually looking at that they could talk about. So Shaker vision in general, all the things they found beautiful, and they use the word beauty or not. One of the, Frederick Evans, one of the elders, late 19th century Shaker figure, said that the beauty has no meaning for us, which is not exactly true. I mean, the Shakers use the word beauty, beautiful or not. They often meant it visually. They often, of course, understood a certain kind of moral beauty that was particular to them. But I think what I also tried to do was get out of that kind of exceptionalism moment and reading of Shakers and Shakerism. So I'll just go through the book in brief form and just give you a sense of what it's about. First one is that my first chapter is on Shakers and the human body. So one thing I found out about the Shakers is, first of all, a lot of the images we have of Shakers are of other people capturing their image. And they're often shown as sort of wild looking like this. This is from a newspaper from 1873, as you can see. And the world, they called them the world, would come and watch them dance. They open their doors to them. But what I found out about Shakers was, so the first thing is, Shakers really like to look at other Shakers. That one of the parts of their visual world of beauty was looking at other Shakers. They like to see themselves dance. They like to see children performing, dancing, just as people do now. They go to school events, oh, how cute the kids are, how well dressed they are, and they're dancing. They did that sort of thing. Over time, they came to believe that Anne Lee, the founder, was beautiful, and some of the other founders were beautiful or handsome. So I'll leave this image and just what I'm going to be doing every now and then with this is going out to the World Wide Web. I hope you can all see that. So there's a great collection of photographs that Hamilton College has. This is on their website showing Frederick Evans, who I just mentioned, with some Shakers. But again, lots of documents of Shakers saying that I went to a certain place and there were many pretty sisters there, or there were pretty people of both sexes there, so men and women, or one Shaker documented a woman saying that she missed seeing the brothers out working, you know, and so quite a few documents of that type. So again, they had their sort of beautiful founders as if they had their sort of beautiful saints in a way, and also looking at each other. The world saw the Shakers as being very dour, and I'm imagining that the Shakers were dour to people coming in from the outside, people like Charles Dickens showing up, and they're not going to smile for him, right? So, but when they're with each other, they always say the smiling faces, we spoke with freedom to each other, meaning that they're in kind of a relaxed state of things. So that was something that I explored. So here's Elder Henry Lynn and Canterbury Shaker with, later on, the Shakers accepted photography, obviously. Earlier on, they did not. Most of my documents stop at about the 1870s that I'm looking at. Later on, the Shakers, they never become like the world, but they accept more and more things. So I really look at the kind of classic Shaker period when they were flourishing, most of my documents are 18 teens through 1870s going forward. Okay. Let us go back to this state of things. And my second chapter is on landscape. So this is really kind of how I started with getting interested in finding out that the Shakers did not only like plain and simple things. They liked things that were colorful, that were, well, they actually used the same word. So here, obviously, you can see in the caption a pretty wild twilight scene by Frederick Church, a Bolivar student of Thomas Cole. The Shakers liked, and I'm not talking about the picture because they're not looking at pictures, they're looking at the real sunsets. I'm showing you that to convey that, but they liked strong out at thunderstorms and snowstorms and the northern lights. In a way that's the first thing that caught my attention many years ago working on this. Rufus Bishop noting documents from New Lebanon saying that northern lights are out and they're beautiful to look at. And I'm thinking that doesn't sound like Shakers to me. And so it really started me on this path to looking for the kind of thing that they're looking for. I'll go to this next one here. So how did they go about this? Shakers would travel from place to place. Many of them were doing what we'd call sort of missionary work or establishing other communities. They had business to attend to, and they'd often go across, much of the nation. And along the way, they would take they would make notes. It's pretty clear that the Shakers had to keep some kind of record of where they were. And some of them wrote minimal records, others embellished it, and they formed a kind of literature that other Shakers would then read. But they would stop off at places like Niagara Falls or Genesee Falls, or they'll stop off at the cities on the way, but talking about nature writing. And they saw these things. They often used the same vocabulary other Americans were using, other Anglo-Americans were using. Words like beautiful in a Claudian sense, right? Edmund Burke in the 18th century talks about the beautiful and the sublime. They use those words, and the sublime, this would be sublime, right? Where it causes sort of fear and awe, and it's this has a certain grandeur. They use the word grandeur a lot. They use the word picturesque quite often, and also the word romantic. But one thing that really got my attention with the documents is the Shakers did not as often describe this as God's world or God's creation. I mentioned Thomas Cole before, but a very famous and influential essay saying that, basically the world is like God's canvas. It's his work of art, and it's better off in raw form and untouched and unsullied and all that kind of thing. The Shakers didn't say that much. When they talked about, and they did sometimes, and obviously they understood the world as God's creation, of course, but when they talked about specific sites like this, They didn't say, oh, I can see the mighty hand of God here. They tended to use aesthetic words, and they tended to keep, which is maybe not surprising. That was surprising. What's not surprising is they tended to find divinity in their own villages, their own meadows, their own places. That was their little piece of heaven on earth, right? Their communities. They loved their communities, and that's where they felt like the divine presence was there. This was, again, not described as often as I thought in any kind of divine sort of terms. So here we have Niagara, Genesee Falls. They would stop off at similar places on the way to Ohio or Indiana, wherever they're going, and they'd go out of their way to see these major sites. They weren't just traveling and not looking around. They wanted to see aspects of nature, including freaky aspects like going down into caves, underground caves, or going into looking for a tree that's 20 feet in diameter. Someone will take them somewhere to look at some extraordinary site. So where there was this sort of landscape tourism that the Shakers would do, again, a lot like other Americans, and they seem to react in the same way to some of these places. Now, these are not Shakers by any means, but these are very unshaker-like people flirting with each other, young people on a mountaintop, which brings me to the question of the prospect. People were very interested in prospects back then. I even think there's a difference between when I was young and now, that people were more interested in the kind of scenic views or going up to some high point somewhere. It seemed to be a real part of certain 18th century, 19th century culture. It was at a sort of high point, no pun intended. Wherever you are, you find the highest place and you go there, and that's what fun is. But many documents that Shakers doing that, again, in pretty aesthetically sensitive terms. They'd go to the high point and they would describe even this kind of thing, like the aerial perspective or what it looked like, or they'd make some other visual comparison to what that is. Even within the villages, they would have these holy mounts or feast grounds, places that were elevated, where they would have the sort of religious ceremonies and events happening sometimes. They would often go up to those. And again, I would expect them to kind of look out from that high point and get some kind of divine thing. And it was often purely aesthetic in their description of it anyway, of what that was like. So the prospect is something they would do, and they did relish. So here again, this painting again. So this whole world of paintings is alien to the Shakers. The Shakers didn't make landscape art in this way. The whole world of imitating the world on a piece of canvas, and artists pridefully signing a name, selling their work to someone who then takes it home and puts a gilded frame around it, puts it on the wall. Every stage of that is non-Shaker, right? So they weren't doing that, but they did represent the world through these travel books. They would describe what they saw in words. Other people could do that, and it did evoke a kind of a mental image. So it's taking what they saw and putting it down, and it's represented in a verbal kind of form. This is not from my Shaker book. Many of these are not. They're similar images, but there's one great document, one of my favorite ones, by someone named Freegift Wells, Waterfleet. When he was on the Erie Canal, he wrote a long description of what he was seeing. And what he did is he wrote it as if it were a moving panorama. He said, here I am, I'm on the boat, I'm moving. Now on my left, I see. Now on my right, I see. And now it's raining. I have an umbrella over my head, and my notebook is under the umbrella as well. So he gives this kind of chronological sort of description in that way. Time is passing. And I say moving panorama. There are two types of panoramas. One is stationary, it goes around you. Then they also have these sort of pre-cinematic moving panoramas where someone would unscroll a scene, roll it. Someone might be playing the piano, and then there might be a delineator, which is so-called a person describing what there is. And so he was sort of like a delineator in that kind of context. So that is described in my book. Now this is a little beach scene. I'm actually going to go to a better view of similar beach. There's a nice thing. So Shakers loved beaches. This is a little bit of a surprise, but it's not just, first of all, in terms of the ocean, the most Shaker villages are not near the ocean. Alfred, Maine, because somewhere near the Great Lakes, but mostly they were inland places. And so when the sight of the ocean was an extraordinary sight for them. And again, it turns out that, that they gave beautiful aesthetic descriptions of these beaches, similar to the way the world's people might. One of them I note in my book by saying, Shaker woman saying that you could see the sun dancing in the waters, where you could see, it was so beautiful to see the waves come one after the other one, and the endless view you could give. But again, very rare to find them say anything about the mightiness of God's creation in the ocean. God's creation and the feeling that was more on their villages, and so it was an aesthetic site. So Shakers would swim and they bob around and they enjoyed all of the visuality of it, as well as anything else. This. A little bit of allegorization. I mentioned one. This is sort of a Civil War era description of the waves coming in, pounding, and so one Shaker did sort of describe that as being like battle, and that is something. So there was a little of that going on. When they did describe nature, if they did any kind of allegory, it was usually a kind of a mundane, a plain one. For instance, winter and spring are battling for supremacy, that kind of thing. Not sort of good and evil or anything like this that you tend to see in the writings. They may have thought it, but I'm judging, it's the Shakers in their own words, what they tell us. There's a view also by Kempset as well as a previous nice view of the beach on Long Island, where Freegift Wells, one of these Shakers, named very prolific writer of these travel books, and the other Shakers seem to have enjoyed his writings. There's sort of an implication that he had a following among his fellow Shakers. Some of these travel books, by the way, were copied, and you'll find multiple copies of them. So it became a literature shared among the communities. But he would go to Long Island and describe the beautiful sunsets and the porpoises, and also the seashells along the shore. So that's part of nature too. They were interested in different kinds of animals, and I have a seashell there. That's not the one I want to show you. That was a little marker for myself. Here's a French painting. This is not Shaker anything, but one night Freegift Wells went to a house of somebody from the world and on Shaker to look at this spectacular collection of seashells, and it really, he loved seeing it, and wrote this description of it. This was a sea captain who traveled the world, so there were seashells from the South Sea, Tahiti, and then brought back to Long Island, this area near Cutchogue, Southold, where he was from, or where he was revisiting. So again, he's making this sort of purposeful, the Shakers couldn't go to museums, but they could go look at seashells and something like that in somebody's house. It wasn't quite the same. And again, you look at this is part of the visuality. It's not plain, it's not simple, it's not Shaker the way we would understand it, but they liked it. Okay. And then again, Hudson River, because of the New Lebanon site, they're going up, especially water fleet coming down to New York City and going back and forth, and often describing the Palisades or the Hudson Highlands, which is up near Cold Spring, sort of further north from this. But again, porpoises swimming in the water, and all this is part of this natural world that they're happy to describe, to enjoy themselves, and then describe it for others in writing. So there's no Shaker landscape paintings, but there are Shaker landscape descriptions. So this is a part of the natural world. A nice document. One of them went to the Fulton Fish Market and just described all the different beautiful, finny specimens, or however he described it. Again, colorful, piled up. It's almost like a Flemish still life or something like that. They were happy to enjoy that visually. Which brings me to chapter 3, which is, as I describe it, the third chapter is the chapter that is most like what people expect to read about the Shakers. It's about their architecture, about their furniture, and things at the village. As I said, the Shakers loved their villages, and by far, that was their main aesthetic experience in life, is seeing beautiful, clean, architectural places. That's their little piece of heaven on earth. So it had every kind of moral and visual and aesthetic and a hygienic advantage for them. And so some of these other documents, like the Fulton Fish Market or some of the other places that I'll show you, those were particular things which show the breadth of Shaker vision. But again, by far, for most Shakers, this was their form of beauty. This is like their Sistine Chapel right here. But again, when you read what the Shaker said about it, it was, you have these millennial laws, right, which restrict ornament and restrict certain things. But again, when you read about what the Shakers say, when they're going from one community to another, when they're describing it, writing that as part of their travelogue too, which often happens, how we know about what they say. They liked things that are big and beautiful, and they were kind of proud, and it was not about self-effacement. It was about pride, about the fine things that they had. And so that's something that, again, you find it's not the humble Shakers who are just, reducing ornament, and there they are. They liked things that they had that were big, that were impressive, and that the outside world is coming to admire. They liked when the world's people would come in and look around at what they had. So this is an older image. It's been painted a deep kind of yellow up here now, but Roundstone Barn, Hancock. This is not a Shaker site, but again, seeing what they say about their villages, the Shakers couldn't grow flowers for beauty. They couldn't have, at this point, later they could, certainly in the 20th century maybe, but not at this time. However, if there were a flowering tree, they could look at that. And so springtime would come. They loved springtime above all seasons. They didn't like fall that much. They almost never comment on autumn leaves, which also surprised me because they liked lots of other things. But here again, a flowering cherry tree or apple tree is very, it's colorful, it's irregular, it's kind of untamed in a certain way, and it's something that they could enjoy. So it's part of their world. And again, there's been so much work done on the Shakers and about, so my goal, I felt, was to look at what Shakers said about their villages and not get down into the details of the construction. So a lot of people have worked on this subject, and again, there's a lot of great literature out there on Shaker material culture for sure. This is a not so inspiring view of Canterbury, New Hampshire, but anyway, this is what they liked to see, especially the meadows around it, the fields, also this sort of tourist control here with these roads, but the kind of order and so forth, cleaning up the villages, all of this is part of their world. Here you get a sense of the sort of regularity that they like. This is going to come into play in a moment when I talk to. They especially liked right angles, although sometimes they did have curved things. But when we talk about city plans of the world, that's going to relate to that soon. Again, kind of straight paths. Here's a site in Kentucky. Sometimes they had bright colors. It was not just about muted colors. This is this well-researched room at Hancock Shaker Village in the brick dwelling there, 1830, showing this sort of discovery. Not that long ago. You know, this kind of bright buttery yellow that they had there. That's also part of their world. I'm going to keep moving along here to stay on the time path that I wanted to set. But again, cleaning, right? They had a hard time distinguishing sort of cleanliness from cleanliness for them was aesthetic, right? It was immoral as well, though. You're cleaning. It's like you're cleaning a place is making your space a bit of heaven. It's clean, it's pure, it's good, it's pure like a shaker is pure, it's pure like heaven is pure, and so that's part of their visual world too. And they do talk about that a lot. Okay, so these orderly sites, and I should say some later stuff here. This is a reconstruction of not one of the earliest of the sites, but when Shakers would go to another Shaker community, it was very systematic. And they're mostly the more elite people traveling and writing. They would come and they'd get a tour almost immediately. They would systematically go through, partly for practical reasons of seeing what the other communities are doing, but also aesthetic reasons. They would talk about the order that they see and how impressed they were with different decisions that are made. They would eventually start to disapprove when one would go to a village, let's say in the 1870s, and they're starting to put in glass knobs. They'd say, no, that's not a good idea, and that made them uncomfortable. So that's the kind of discussion that they're having. Okay, I'm going to go to my fourth chapter now out of the 5. This is the meeting house, Sabotage Lake, as you can see. So again, this is the world they construct. But what I found very interesting was, in addition to this world that they're constructing, which is obviously very contained and very orderly, I think my favorite chapter to work on, no, we're not there for the next chapter yet. I want to comment on this building and the next one, so I'm getting ahead of myself. But this is a great stone dwelling at Enfield, New Hampshire. And this building got a lot of attention from Shakers. And again, it puts in it puts into context what they thought about themselves, because they thought this was like a palace. It was beautiful, and with all this fine stone, and one Shaker who had just left the Shakers but described the look of it, saying the light would glitter across the surface and little twinkling lights from the rising sun hitting it. And again, the fine stone is 100 feet long. Almost all of the descriptions of it say how long it was, and 58 feet wide. And so they were proud of it. It was not self-effacing. And if you look at other rural residences where other people live, this is a dwelling house where other people lived in this nearby. No one had anything like this. So it was a superior kind of a building. Again, it was something that they could find a great aesthetic pleasure in, and pride that they had something better than other people had. And why shouldn't they? They have Zion. This is the heaven on earth they've created. There's that round stone barn again. And then this is that meeting house in New Lebanon. That was that first space we saw where the Shakers were dancing. Again, impressive space. And this building I want to call your attention to, at Hancock Shaker Village, this brick dwelling, 1830, which Henry Blinn, whose picture I showed you before, say about this, and be very aesthetically sensitive things about how beautiful it looked for the way the red played off against the white marble. These are marble bits over here. There's also marble flooring downstairs that he mentioned. This building was also painted over, so that's kind of a surprising Shaker thing, just to see the aesthetic emphasis given to that, perhaps. It was also painted red originally to unify the brick, which is a little kind of a falsification. You expect more maybe from the world's people. Painting something brick, by the way, was widely done. It was not not particular to this building. It was widely practiced. It may be something that you wouldn't have expected, but as Blinn said, the bricks were somewhat irregular, so to unify them, they were painted red beyond that. What I like what Blinn does is he goes to Philadelphia soon after seeing that, and he describes the buildings in Philadelphia in a similar way. They have red brick, and they play off against the fine stone, and how nice that looks. So again, he's using the same words to describe his federal period house, built for a wine merchant, and then a physician lived there. But he's using the same words of aesthetic appreciation for World's building and for the Shaker building. Okay, so now we're at the fourth chapter, which is Shakers out in the world, especially in the cities. And this was probably the most fun for me to work on, to see them go, just be tourists in New York. And again, they had a lot of appreciation for what they saw. So I'm starting out with this view of Central Park. They love Central Park as it was being developed at this time. A group of them went there and it was described in very glowing terms as the most wonderful combination of nature and art. You know, nature and art together, and the bodies of water, the little buildings that there were. Here's Central Park in the winter time. But again, even the world's buildings that were shown there, such as this one, which was just completed at the time the Shakers were visiting, is Belvedere Castle. You may be seen not far from the Metropolitan Museum behind it. Actually, in this the style that it is, you can see, you know, nature and art, right? You got the stone here and stone up there, so they appreciated that and saw it as just a beautiful thing. Okay. This is where you can see Second Bank of the United States. The Shakers did like some very ornate buildings, and they commented on that, but they seem to have a particular affinity for the Greek Revival, right? Greek Revival buildings we have, such as Strickland's building here, we have, there's no pedestal, it's very spare and simplified and so forth. So they seem to like that and comment on those and describe those more than they do Gothic Revival, for example. So here's that great stone dwelling that we saw before, again, it has a certain kind of blunt force to it, a certain kind of a stony quality. Things pushed against the plane of the building. So that's the Shaker building has certain aesthetic features in common with the Greek Revival. So that's not surprising. When they go to New York and Philadelphia, they tend to like that style. Girard College, another example of this. Again, Shakers going there like other tourists did, by Thomas Walter's architect, that they would climb up on the roof, which you could do then, get the great view out there, talk about how much money it cost to build it, and the fine stone and so forth. So their language, just as with landscape, is very similar with architecture itself. They liked regular cities. They liked Philadelphia. You can imagine that they liked the rectilinear plan of Philadelphia and also of New York as well. But then again, so did other Americans. I've had an opportunity to read a lot of travel books, even from the 18th century. People were saying how they liked cities where they didn't like tangled cities. So here's Lower Manhattan. Here's Wall Street right here, and again, most people, including the Shakers too, were visiting and saying that they didn't like this down here. These were old cow paths or Native American paths that were turned into roads later. This Broad Street had been a Dutch canal, and they didn't feel good there. They felt good up here, right? Here's that City Hall and St. Paul's Chapels here, the World Trade Center site back there. They walked around here. They liked the regularity. It reminded them more of Shaker villages, and they also reminded them when they saw the green, the little patches of green, also that. But they also, let's go to the next view here. Oops. They also liked when they got back, from a place like New York and went back to their villages. They liked that a lot. Here's a place that got a lot of Shaker attention, the Fairmont Waterworks, where you have fountains were perfect for Shakers because anything has to do with water or engineering. As most of you know, I'm sure, if you don't, I'll tell you, Shakers were not opposed to technology. It was not like an Amish thing or whatever. They love technology. They like machines. And you can visit now. You can go there and free of charge as go and see the mechanism here. They would take the water from the Schuylkill River and send it up and drink it. I wouldn't want to drink that water, but that's what they did then. It was a little cleaner. So again, sort of Greek revival looking architecture, but especially, and there was a fountain there, actually, there was a fountain. This is an old postcard of it. And again, several Shaker descriptions of how beautiful this fountain was. Let's say it looked more like, this, right? You can see it from a distance. I found amusing because there was a nymph there, a nymph with a bittern, and the Shakers didn't have representations of nymphs or anything, hardly. The human figure would be a rare thing to be represented in any way. So they don't describe the nymph. They describe the engineering, the water, the splashing, how beautiful the splashing looks, but they don't mention the pretty girl here. Okay. I'm getting a little past my time, so I won't take too much longer, but again, one of my favorite moments in seeing all of these, let's see what happens with this if it comes up. Sometimes the images are slow to download. There's a really fun document where there were a group of Shakers in New York, and they were, prominent Shakers, but one of them decided, Sister Clarissa decided they would all stay an extra day to go see the Croton distributing reservoir. This is the Croton Reservoir that was there. So, that's what it looks like in this photograph. It was a sort of neo-Egyptian thing. It was an amazing engineering thing. And I'm going to go and show you what it looked like here. So this is 42nd Street here. This is where the New York Public Library is. This is where Bryant Park is. This had the Crystal Palace there. So the Shaker just, it's actually Free Gift Wells again, says that they delayed going back a whole day just to see this marvel of architecture and engineering. This is now gone. Now then they use the reservoirs up in Central Park. Before that, I'll tell you, if you go to the New York Public Library, part of the walls of this are still extant down here about this level. You can go in and see part of that. Ask the librarians there and they'll show you. So part of this great reservoir is actually still visible. And Free Gift Wells was writing and saying that they saw the reservoir and also adjacent curiosities. He didn't say the Crystal Palace, but he obviously meant that. But so the Crystal Palace was next door. Again, it was a marvel of engineering, and it was a place where they had sort of art exhibits. And let's see if I can get anything to show on my screen here. There we go. There's the inside of it. You've already saw the outside. There's no evidence the Shakers ever went inside. They weren't supposed to go to museums or shows or circuses or anything, so they probably stayed outside. But still, it was a extravagant sight, and there was something they could enjoy. So this was part of their visual world in its own way. So the last of these world's monuments, before I just show you a quick one for my 5th chapter, monument, big thing for Shakers. Even though it involved battles, they didn't like to see forts and soldiers. It kind of creeped them out. But a group went to see this. Again, they tended to like things that had nice fences around them. and beautiful ground. So combination of green and architecture. You could climb up for 12.5 cents. And, but again, it's kind of pure architecture design. This is something they would like. There's some people climbing to the top of this. The Shaker was very careful writing back to say, that in our group, nobody went up to the top. None of us went up. It repeated it. So they didn't spend the money. They didn't go up and do that. So they were, they liked free things. That's why they liked fountains, and they tended to stay on the outside of things. Okay. And well, one Shaker saw a circus chariot, that kind of a one-off, but again, said it was a gorgeous chariot with gilding. So I only have a couple more images. There's 2 more images to show you. For the 5th chapter, there was this era of manifestations when there was a lot of kind of fervent religious feeling in the communities. And this is a famous work, Hannah Cahona's, of a tree of blazing, tree of light, or blazing tree. There's a little fire on this tree and so forth. So they did finally make some 2-dimensional art. It wasn't widely known. It wasn't discussed. There aren't that many documents about it, but we do have the works. Again, they are part of the visual world. It's quite a fervent one, as you can see. Much of the chapter, the last chapter, is about verbal descriptions of things. In other words, they would have visions. This is where Shaker vision, I used it in 2 senses. Vision, like get your vision checked, you see things, but also a vision is something that didn't happen, it's not visual. So the 5th chapter is about that kind of vision. They're extraordinary that people would have visions. They might have them during a meeting or some other time of seeing something, and they would give each other gifts, and they'd be an instrument. They'd be receiving some a word from the other side, from heaven in some way, or from an early Shaker who's deceased, and they would describe diamonds and fruit and so forth, and they would give each other gifts too. I found that fascinating. It's almost disconcerting looking at Shaker documents. Someone say, "Well, I went and Sister Lucy gave me a rose, and I gave her a diamond necklace," meaning they pretended to. They would just say to each other, "Here, I'm giving you this," and it didn't exist. But part of what they would give each other were like the things that you find in, let's say, American art, right? They give each other wine. They didn't drink wine, but they could give someone spiritual wine or fancy fruit, bananas and oranges. Or I gave them or gold and again diamonds and rubies and all that kind of thing. So they could see them in their mind. It wasn't actual, but it was something that they sort of evoked with words, and sometimes they also evoked them with their songs, which I also point out. Okay, I'm going to skip this little bit about Shakers in the world, except to say that if there are any people out there working on Shakers, any young people, I think there's still room to run. I think this is a chair from nearby here in Texas. There were similarities between what the Shakers were doing, what other people were doing. I'm interested in the question of importation of Chinese furniture in terms of sort of simplicity. Some of you might know that in Walden Pond, that Thoreau had his bed there was actually a Chinese chair that was reshaped. So it's out there. And some Shakers did see some Chinese furniture and made a description of it and seemed to like it. But I am going to end with this one last view, because it has a chair on a peg on a wall. If you ever go to a Shaker museum and you don't see a chair on a peg on a wall, you'll probably want your money back. So I don't want you to want your money back, not that you're paying any money, but this is that. I want to show you that for that purpose, but also just to finish with this and say, yes, this was part of their world. This orderly interiors, this was absolutely part of the aesthetic world, but finally, I hope you can see that the Shakers had a much broader kind of sense of vision and beauty than this. So thank you for listening. And if there are any questions out there, I'll be happy to hear them.
Thank you, Dr. Manca. That was a really fascinating talk. And for me personally, I love this research because I spend so much time at Hancock Shaker Village, really considering very deeply the experience of being a Shaker within the confines of a Shaker village. And so to really look outside of that and to speculate on these experiences in the world is just a really valuable thing. So thank you. And two, I mean, in particular, I love your discussion on Olmsted, because there is a real kinship between, I think, the way that Olmsted sculpted landscape and engaged communities with landscape that bears some similarity to the ways that the Shakers were also crafting their own landscapes. And so it gave me a lot to think about in that respect. So thank you for that. We do have a few questions. I will start with you mentioned earlier in the talk that the Shakers could not go to museums. There was a question about why that was.
Well, because it involved the things that were crafted by the world in a certain way. I mean, some of these buildings, I mean, a lot of the things they liked were actually practical things, like bridges. They liked to look at trains. They thought trains were beautiful. The engineering sites and so forth, fountains, they all, even if they were aesthetic, they had something, but um, it was entertainment. They thought a museum was entertainment. And so there was one document where somebody was in the state capitol in Massachusetts, and in one room below somebody was shown Audubon's birds, and the shaker was writing this down and said, well, I bore it patiently. Something, I can't remember what the phrase was, like, yeah, he showed me, and to be polite, I let him show me. So almost kind of apologizing for that. But no, they couldn't go to circuses. They weren't supposed to board ships even, but they did sometimes. They didn't like to spend money. So going into a museum and spending money and looking at something that's signed by an artist and put on a wall, that's not something they wanted to do.
That makes sense. There are two questions relating to color. There was a question about, was there much description of color in Shaker writings? And two, were the colors that they used specifically in the interiors of architecture, did they symbolize anything?
Um, well, they did have colors that they used outside to mark certain kinds of buildings, but they did mention color. Yes, they did mention color, and they seemed to like the color. If They mentioned color a lot. Now, the way the Shakers tended to color inside was in planes of color. They didn't have wallpaper. They did have striped chairs with color, but they tended to use color very simply. Yeah, they were interested in color, and again, some of the research done in your own community there, Sarah, about the those bright yellow paints. It's fascinating that some of the colors are real zingy. Yeah.
And there is a very vast can of worms that has been opened up, but perhaps you can address. There was a question about the difference between the Shakers and other pastoral American utopian groups. And Marjorie is asking if the aesthetic of the Shakers relates or is the result of the Millennialist Doctrine and their role as redeemers of the earth.
And what was the last phrase?
I mean, the Millennialist Doctrine and their role as redeemers of the earth. Does the aesthetic come out of that ideology, I believe is the question.
Sure. I mean, it certainly does for their own communities. I mean, they're creating heaven on earth, and they thought that heaven was simple. Even a plate, they want to have it simple because heaven is simple, and that's what their belief was. Heaven is clean. So certainly for their own communities. When things happened outside the communities, it was almost kind of off the, it was kind of, I think I got the feeling that not everything was covered. By Shakerdism didn't cover everything that they could have seen or done. So if they saw the Northern Lights, that's something that's happening, and it's not, they didn't do it. They're just looking at it. And so not everything was covered. Of as I say, sort of like heaven on earth, or the equivalent to that. in their communities, it was true for their furniture and everything that they did there and their aesthetics. So they had their own aesthetics for their own stuff, and then they also saw things that were happening that attracted the eye. But clearly, if they saw the Crystal Palace, the palace, that's not that was on a lower moral plane than they were.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I'd answer that question. There's visual beauty and moral beauty, and there's also sort of accidental beauty. I mean, one fun documentary, a shaker found a dead cat on the along the way that seemed to have the profile of a man on it. And they thought that was fascinating, but it's not. It's amoral. It's off the chart, off the grid. But their communities were not off the grid. That was that was moral beauty and visual beauty.
One last question from Jean, which is really interesting. To what extent do you think the Shakers saw the structures that they observed in the world as justifying or mimicking their own architecture and structure?
Well, I'll ask a clarification. You mean were the Shakers influencing other people? Is that the question?
I think that's the implication, yeah. Do you think the Shakers saw the subsequent architecture and design of the world as being influenced by the Shakers?
I'm not aware of that. No Shaker ever said it, that I saw that they were influencing others in that direction. I think they felt like they were holding their position and others moving in other directions. But again, when they found something from the outside, like Greek Revival architecture or straight streets in Manhattan and Philadelphia, they liked it when they saw it, but I don't think they believed the causality was there. Although most of my documents stop at a certain point now, because as you know, everyone knows, the Shakers start making furniture and selling it broadly and clothing and yes, at that point, then the Shakers are definitely getting out into the world and they're selling their stuff. So I think after the Civil War, you start to see the Shakers influencing other things. Of course, in 20th century, it's clear, and even modernism, like Charles Sheeler, some of the artists are actually looking at the Shakers. And so, yeah, but from this sort of earlier period, I don't think so. Later period, yeah, the Shakers are doing that.
Great. Well, I think, we just have one last question, it looks like. Interesting. It's interesting to think about what they were creating for themselves, but their aesthetic was also present in the goods they marketed to the world. Do you think about the design and colors they used to sell their goods in your text?
Do I think about the...
Or is there a consideration to sort of the outward-looking marketing in addition to the inward-looking design and architecture of the spaces for the Shakers?
That is something that's out there. That's something I cover that much in my book. It's interesting to look at. They do bend the rules a little bit. When they start selling those seed packs, for example, there's a lot of ornamentation on them that they themselves don't have around them. So there's a little bit of salesmanship, and I think they do kind of bend their rules when they're selling to the outside world. So it's an interesting topic. I don't get into the more mass marketing of the Shaker things to other people. I'm more interested in the Shaker aesthetics, and that's something that is more about the world's aesthetics. And people have also worked on that, about people who, what is the world getting from the Shakers? My book is about the Shakers, Gotcha. So.
Well, maybe you could give that one to one of your doctoral students to dissertate on.
Great idea, yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Joseph. There are some really lovely little accolades in the chat section that I encourage you to read before you log off. And thank you everyone out there in the world who joined us. We will be releasing a new suite of virtual programs that will be running through July and August. So if you're not on our e-news, please consider signing up through our website, and hopefully we'll see you at one of our virtual talks in the future. Thank you all again. I will sign off now. All right. Take care. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah.